I always unmute myself on the OBS and then not on my recording device. So hello, everybody. Welcome to another Focus Locus. Okay, welcome to Focus Locus Presents. This week we are showing They Can't Take That Away, the history, the legacy of the Fillmore, a film by the Bay Area Video Coalition. We'll be joined by director and producer Lubna Jacory, as well as Elizabeth Pepin Silva, who provided research consultation for the film, who is the co-author of Harlem of the West, the definitive book on the subject of the Fillmore. The other author being Lewis Watts, who is featured prominently in the show. So while this is a story about San Francisco, and I'm very excited to get into the details of this incredible history, the themes of a vibrant cultural boom and how material conditions of oppression can change the culture of neighborhoods through gentrification and displacement. The future of arts, these are familiar themes for us anywhere, I think, throughout the US, either in our own neighborhoods or neighborhoods nearby, or neighborhoods we've been to, or neighborhoods we've moved to, maybe. So I want to delve into the specifics of the Fillmore and also get into some of these themes in general. As always, if you are watching with us, please get your questions ready and put them in the chat on YouTube or Facebook or Twitch, and we will read them when we get to the question and answer portion. I think this will be a very rich discussion, and I am very excited to get into it. So without further ado, let's watch. So this is They Can't Take That Away, the legacy of the Fillmore, from the Bay Area Video Coalition, directed and produced by Lubna Jacory. I think what else? That's it.
When you hear the Fillmore, what do you think of? Music, food, culture? Well, I've lived in this neighborhood for 5 years, and I know that it's named after the 13th US president, Millard. I also know that it's been a live music destination for more than a century, that it's been the heart of Black culture here in San Francisco for quite some time. But things are changing. There's Michelin-starred restaurants and boutiques. The Church of St. John Coltrane closed down, but I know that every night of the week I can catch live jazz at the Sheba Lounge, and that makes me feel connected to a rich part of the Fillmore's history. Let's go back in time and look at the heyday of jazz in the Fillmore with Lubna Jacory.
These streets in the Fillmore district tell tales of reinvention. The Fillmore rose in the aftermath of the 1906 earthquake as a Western addition to the devastated downtown. Jewish merchants mixed with Asian immigrants in a lively new city center. On these streets, a Japanese population was forcibly removed, and these streets birthed an African-American jazz scene that was called the Harlem of the West.
Many newcomers to this tech-heavy city may not know about the thriving music and culture heyday of the neighborhood. But for the San Franciscans who were here back then, the memories of nightlife and community are still as vivid as ever.
I wanna tell about a fella who's a trumpet whiz. Now he's been called a crazy rebel, but most call him Diz. And he is swinging and the jazz kicking.
The Fillmore was very bustling. It was in the early 40s, and it was bustling. I can remember about 1945, there were many black-owned nightclubs. Well, with black folks, if you have a restaurant, you gotta have some blues and jazz.
My father, his career was like in the 40s and the 50s. He played at all the major venues up along the Manor Plaza, the Wesley Johnson's Playhouse, the Big Glass, the Club Alabama, all these places. He used to tell me about where they were playing at and stuff. And my mother worked at the Scully Owl drugstore right there on Gary and Fillmore. She was the first black woman to work there for the Scully drug. And we were right there on the corner, across from the Fillmore Auditorium or the Primalal Ballroom. That was ground zero for me. I knew all about this. That's all I knew. It was very vibrant. The people would dress up to come out. They would be like dressed to the nine. The women would be wearing these wonderful hats and gloves and stuff.
Memories of this time have been beautifully preserved in the book Harlem of the West. They describe a unique moment in history when top musicians would mingle with neighborhood locals. While the most famous black musicians could play in the downtown clubs, they weren't allowed to sleep at hotels there. So they'd come back to the Fillmore and play into the wee morning hours. Ironically, segregation had played a role in creating a black community that was welcoming to all parts of society.
Black people played on a circuit called the Chitlin Circuit. And that Chitlin Circuit went all the way from New York City to Chicago, all around the nation. And the Fillmore Jazz District was part of that Chitlin Circuit. In those days, the performances were between 9 and 1, but there were after-hour joints. One of those joints in the Fillmore was called Bop City.
And Bop City was where they had many great people such as Ella Fitzgerald, Sarah Vaughan, Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, all of the big major people that performed at some of these other clubs, which were maybe more downtown or in other areas. They would come to Bop City, which was like an after-hours club, and they would hang out there and have something to eat and relax, and they would jam and play.
This festive moment in the city's history was partly caused by the tragedy that preceded it. Before it was the Fillmore Jazz District, it was a thriving Japantown.
My Japanese friends they had to go, and I was wondering, where did they go?
During World War II, Japanese populations across the West Coast were forced out of their homes into internment camps, meaning the Fillmore, with more than 200 Japanese-owned businesses, rapidly changed in character. The neighborhood's African-American population increased from just over 2,000 to nearly 15,000 people between 1940 and 1950, and Harlem of the West flourished.
At its height, it was wall-to-wall people from Hayes Street all the way up to California, even farther. Some people would come, and they would come Friday afternoon, and they wouldn't go home till Sunday. They would just party 24 hours.
Just from one place
Yeah,
to the
exactly.
other. Louis Watts is one of the co-authors of the definitive history of the neighborhood, the book Harlem of the West. He spent decades walking these streets, collecting the history and photos that may have otherwise been lost to time.
This is the block where a lot of things happened. Red's Shine Parlor was at 1549, right over there. Reggie's New Chicago Barbershop was right here behind us. I went into Red's Shine Parlor, and Red Powell, who was the proprietor, I said, wow, this is great. He had pictures of everybody that had gone through the Fillmore, like entertainers, local people.
In the 40s.
Yes, in the 40s and 50s. But when I saw him, it was in the 90s. And when I went back, the space where he was empty and the walls were empty. And I remember someone out in the street, I said, what happened to these photographs? And he says, I think someone rescued him, but nobody knew. So I was across the street at the New Chicago Barbershop, and Reggie Pettis said, oh, they're in my back room. And I almost fell over.
The vibrant jazz and culture scene in these photos existed in a short window of history. It was formed in the aftermath of one tragedy, the displacement of the Japanese, and it was lost to another tragedy of removal and displacement caused by urban redevelopment. The neighborhood's rapid population increase was partly responsible for the city to designate some areas as what they called urban blight.
Things were very much in disrepair. I remember growing up in there in the 50s, the buildings were dilapidated. And they were roach infested, rat infested, mice infested, and no paint on them. And this is the environment I remember growing up in. And that's when the redevelopment came in there and just changed the entire scene up, because it took the spine out of it.
As the neighborhood grew older, it needed repairs. And that's a simple way of describing redevelopment. But the repairs were bittersweet. It modernized the Fillmore physically, but so many of the residents had to move out.
The Fillmore then got swept into a national movement of urban redevelopment, which was considered by some as an effort of black removal.
We were displaced. We had a house up on Scott and Ellis Street, and they moved us out of that. We had a business on O'Farrell and Fillmore. We had a used furniture junk store, 2 levels, and it was, it was a vibrant business, and they tore that building down. So they just displaced us, and we had to move. They gave you a paper and saying this such and such dwelling is going to be demolished on a such and such a date. And hopefully we can get you back in here, which to a lot of families and people, they never came back. And our businesses never came back. We had restaurants, we had hotels, we had record shops, we had clothing stores, we had beauty salons and everything. All of it wiped out. And it never came back.
I don't want to see us go back. I want to see jazz spread, and that's what it has done.
Our scene coming back, I don't see that. I just don't see the numbers, But I've been very fortunate that the families that are still here, I have found some younger musicians to work with that are working with me now. They look up to me, and I'm trying to be a mentor to them, like how I was mentored. So I'm just trying to pass along what I got, so I'm trying to give it back to them.
The legacy of the Fillmore remains alive in the music, in people's memories, in a rescued history. It's also preserved in plain sight, in places you might not suspect.
This is the building where Jimbo's Bop City was located, around the corner on Post, right in what is Japantown now. This was probably an internationally known after-hours place that was started originally by Jimbo Edwards, who had a Waffle House, and then musicians in town would come and say, can we jam here? A lot of these buildings were torn down, and in the middle of that process, neighborhood activists sort of stopped the redevelopment agency from doing it, and instead of just tearing down buildings, they were able to sue them and get them to move some of them.
That's right. This Victorian that used to be Bop City was put on a trailer and moved here around the corner. It received landmark status from the city in 2014 for its history, both as Bop City and then as Marcus Books, the nation's oldest African-American bookshop, which also closed in 2014. But above all else, the legacy lives on in the hearts of those who were fortunate to have been there.
I remember we had a mural down the street, and there was an older gentleman there looking at it, and I said, so what do you think about this? He says, I come see it every day because it reminds me of the best time of my life.
The Fillmore's glory days for jazz may be just a memory, but black art and culture are still here, in pockets. One has to wonder, what is San Francisco doing to support contemporary artists? Is it stuck in a bygone era, or is it bringing life to something new? I'm here at the African American Art and Culture Complex. For 40 years, it supported the Black community and helped artists and young people create and thrive. In part 2 of this episode on the Fillmore, Sade McDougall talks to creatives and city officials about what we need to do to keep artists of color in San Francisco.
Out of the rubble of the city's misguided urban renewal of the 1960s and 70s, the Fillmore neighborhood is growing into its new identity. History is still celebrated, but with a modern touch.
I did a piece that focused on Wesley Johnson's Club Flamingo, and then there was a piece that was a bit more edgy that focused on the redevelopment agency and sort of the destruction of this community. For the anti-eviction mapping project, I wanted to focus on the clubs, but I also wanted to focus on just the real people of the Fillmore, because that's what really made it the Harlem of the West.
Mark Harris is a visual artist creating social commentary work. His pieces reflect some parts of his reality in San Francisco as an artist of color. In a city known for its creative and innovative spirit, things are changing.
The 3.9 Collective is a collective of African-American artists who live and work in San Francisco. 3.9 is referencing a census statistic that basically says the African-American population will be at 3.9%. I believe by the next census. If the community of creatives is diminished to the point where, you know, it's like an endangered species, that you have to move elsewhere. And I think that's a real loss for the city as well as the technology community, because they're here because of the reputation of the city.
Jacory Baptiste is one of those artists carrying forward the reputation of the city and the legacy of the Fillmore. He's a singer-songwriter and composer and has been playing music since he was 8 years old while growing up in the neighborhood and hearing about the jazz days.
Growing up in this neighborhood has been amazing. I love it. The community, the music presence that I grew up around, the influences through the church. I mean, I had a great upbringing here in the city, and I'm grateful.
Jacory was looking for a piano player and met Sam Peoples Jr. Now, Sam is passing along his own decades of experience in the Fillmore.
Once he seen that I had an interest in the history of Fillmore, he just pulled out all this wealth of information, and for me, that was just valuable. I felt amazed, just a sense of pride too, to first of all know that here it is. I'm curious about the history in the Fillmore, and I've been doing music with this gentleman, and now he's given me this wealth of information. It's just, I felt very lucky. Connecting the age gap would be probably one of the things I like to do. And I just think it's just about showing how actually a lot of the instrumentation of the music of the 30s and 40s actually fits well with today's music and is used by today's producers.
At the African American Art and Culture Complex, visitors can see exhibits from Black artists, attend performances, or take classes. Its directors say that offering resources for artists beyond material support is also crucial to helping them succeed.
We also are a space for adult services with health and wellness, with people who have specific needs. So there are so many different people who rely on this space for whatever they're up to creatively, and on a social justice and social services platform.
The center is a beacon of support and activity for arts in this historic neighborhood, but it's becoming increasingly difficult for artists of color to stay in this city.
I think in the city overall, we're seeing a lot of these communities that were once known as the epicenter of the arts, whether it's the Mission or the Fillmore District, who have suffered from the high cost of living and gentrification and shifts in population, and how that's affected the ability to maintain arts in those communities, especially that are authentically created by the communities that they're known for. So whether it's the African American community in the Fillmore or the Latino or Latinx community in the Mission, we see that kind of challenge of groups trying to maintain that flavor and that sense of vitality for that specific community and struggling to do so. in the light of the high cost of living and doing business.
According to the U.S. Census taken every 10 years, the African American population in San Francisco peaked at 13% in 1970. From 1970 to 2010, that number dropped by half and has been on the decline ever since.
So when you hear that number, the experience is how much of yourself do you get to see? And what is the range of yourself that you get to see? If 37% of the homeless population or the houseless population is African American, then what do you think our view is? You know, like how much of us do we see shining, surviving, thriving, have a good quality of life? And so that has an emotional impact. That has a psychological impact.
And artists in the Bay Area have to deal with the financial impact of the soaring cost of living here.
Right now, the retail and just basic living space in San Francisco is extremely expensive.
As we know, there's a lack of parity in the economy, particularly when you're looking at communities of color. And it's even magnified more so in the arts, because arts itself is a sector that's underfunded. So when you are also a person of color or from a differing or marginalized community and an artist, that is even doubly challenging for you to be able to be economically supported.
That doesn't always mean it's easy for artists to get the support they need.
Put your money where your mouth is. Budgets are about priorities, and they talk about what our values are. And I don't see that the city really has a plan or really values the African American community or the artistic community here. So, show me the money, show us in a way that's real, that we matter and that you care about keeping the community here, and not only keeping it here, but helping it thrive.
Cheryl Davis is the head of the San Francisco Human Rights Commission. She's lived in the Western Addition and has a long history of community work in the neighborhood.
I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to keep more artists and people of color in San Francisco, specifically because, first and foremost, I know that this current mayor, Mayor London Breed, has a special place in her heart for the arts, has contributed and really made some commitments to the arts. I'm hopeful for District 5. I know that there are some spaces in the community that they've been looking at to actually build artist residence and live-work lofts and things.
There have been efforts over the years to revitalize a Fillmore Jazz District. Optimistic plans for a new Fillmore Heritage Center have been mired in difficulties for the currently closed complex. The annual Fillmore Jazz Festival is one success that carries the neighborhood's name and brings thousands each July. But some say it will take more than just good intentions and fond memories to infuse the neighborhood with more support for the arts.
The number one issue or challenge or solution is like how to actually invest in that. Not to talk about the importance of it, but to actually put money where it's needed. So I'm hopeful that some of the housing that's going to come online is going to be specifically for folks who have been displaced, and giving them kind of right to return or first right to come back. And so we know who those people are. They're predominantly people of color. But that we also want to make it so that our artists are not being pushed out of the city, because we will lose so much of our culture if we lose artists.
A community without art is not really a community. You need that ability to express yourself in whatever form, whether it's audio through music or visual arts. And that's what creates the vitality and vibrancy of a city. And San Francisco is known for that.
Joy has always been, in my opinion, one of the strengths of the African American community. In the hundreds of years that we've been in this country and under really dire and difficult circumstances, we've maintained our joy throughout. From gospel music to giving birth to major genres of music. Blues and jazz came from our community. That comes out of experiencing pain and oppression, it makes you creative.
Those who want to hold on to the neighborhood's legacy have a vision of teaching children music through the lens of history.
Any time you know history, it's a benefit for knowing the truth about where you are, where you're going. And without that, it's kind of a mystery.
Darlene Roberts spent time in the Fillmore in her 20s, and along with Dr. David Hardiman, is the co-founder of Fillmore Jazz Ambassadors.
My big vision is to walk in a room seeing a room full of kids with instruments. My vision is seeing us unite all the elements of jazz together under one roof so that when visitors come, they know where to go for jazz. We want to unite everything jazz here.
I see it's important also for us to do this, and Sam helps me see that. We're writing music, we're composing, we're performing, but there's a deeper kind of connection that happens when you get up on stage and you share your music. That's a part of how I grew up. That's all San Francisco, that's all Fillmore, you know, so you hear it and you feel it when we perform or when we do our music.
And the Fillmore today is, it's survivors. It's comprised of survivors. It's people that are, figuring out how to make it still. They want to live and thrive just like everyone else in this city. So it's a far cry from what it used to be. But we're still here.
There's something the Romans call genius loci, or spirit of a place. And to me, the Fillmore has always had this creative spirit, and people still come here for entertainment. But one of my favorite things about living here is I get to say, I'm a Black artist living in the Fillmore, a place made famous by Black artists. The Fillmore lives on. On our next transmission, we look at the art and culture of the Tenderloin.
Hello, everybody. This is Focus Locus Presents. You just watched They Can't Take That Away, The Legacy of the Fillmore. So we are now joined by the director and producer of this show, Livna Jacory, as well as Elizabeth Pepin Silva, who was a research consultant on this particular project, but was also the co-author of Harlem of the West. Lewis Watts, who is the other author, was prominently featured in the first half-ish of the show. So welcome.
Thank you so much. This is so exciting. I'm glad people on the East Coast and online viewers were able to learn about this little known kind of slice of San Francisco history.
Thank you so much for having us. It's a pleasure to be here.
Of course. Al Williams, director of Northampton Open Media, is also on. I should say hello.
Hey everyone, how are you? It was great to have you guys.
So as I said at the beginning, we are talking about San Francisco and the Fillmore in particular, as this is what the show is about. But I do want everyone watching, particularly from Western Massachusetts, where Northampton Open Media calls home, to think about the themes that we discuss as something that is universal to a lot of cities in the US, particularly displacement of marginalized communities, gentrification, and these sort of powerful cultural booms that happen and then are fizzled away by material conditions. So since Focus Locus is a show that generally focuses on the mechanisms of media production, we're going to sort of slide into this by talking about the creation of the show itself. So this is part of the Transmission, which is a episodic show by Bay Area Video Coalition, right?
Yeah, so a little bit of background. Bay Area Video Coalition is a nonprofit that's been in San Francisco for almost 45 years now, and it's a nonprofit, and we offer training, access, education, community facilities to a pretty wide variety of creatives, affordable. We strive to, you know, support underrepresented voices. And then like Northampton Open Media, SF Commons is the city's public access TV station, San Francisco's public access TV station. So my role at BayVac as senior production manager is mostly that I manage the city's public access TV station. And so one of the programs that's been around for a while on SF Commons is called Transmission. And it is a neighborhood by neighborhood look at arts and culture in the city. So nitty gritty background, my role had been vacant for some time, so Transmission hadn't been produced for some time. And when I came into the role about a year ago, actually, I'm close to my year, I was handed this, you know, hey, we got a grant from the California Arts Council to do something on the Fillmore, here, do it. And being a native of San Francisco, you know, born and raised in the city, I would see on Fillmore Street, you know, banners, things, you know, little kind of engravings in the sidewalk, commemorative bricks about Fillmore jazz. And so like I knew, but I didn't really know. And when the project got handed to me, do a TV documentary, and there's a lot of other community elements in that as well. Here, do this, and it was kind of like do it the way you want, which I was very lucky about. And I started looking into this and found, you know, first obviously the Harlem of the West work, which Elizabeth and Louis Watts have been working on collecting for decades, and I don't know where this history would be without their work and without their book. And also there was a KQED, a local public television PBS station documentary that Elizabeth co-produced, associate produced, worked on, and that was like 20 years. It's older.
1999, hard to believe.
And so nobody had done a video thing on this. And so as I started to look into it, you know, Louis Watts was one of the first people I met in person, and you know, I started to think, who are the characters? And he told me so many had passed, and it just became a bigger thing than I expected. I saw that there was this very special, very important story to tell, and you know, we'll get more into it, I'm sure, in the questions, but chose to try to weave or to separate into two sections. You know, let's tell a story of the history, and then now, what is here now? Who is here now? What's happening now? What can we do now? So to bring it in that more, you know, because my background is as kind of like a news journalist. And so I wanted to make it relevant to current issues. And of course, this was completed earlier this year, and I worked on it last year and earlier this year. Black Lives Matter has been around for years, and it became increasingly relevant, you know, kind of over the recent months with it coming even more to the forefront. So yeah, that's kind of how it came to be in my hands and how I started to investigate it.
Yeah, so that sort of is a great transition to my next question, which is about this collaboration between Elizabeth Silva and Louis Watts and the Harlem of the West, which is obviously it's a book is longer than a show, you know. So I wanted to hear about what that collaboration, having a research consult, was like with this show, and also how did you cut down such a vast history?
Yeah, I'll answer the second part of your question, then I'll let Elizabeth address her collaboration, because they've been working on the book and the material for, you know, many years, and both of them physically being in the neighborhood. She probably has the book around, but this is the newest edition of the book. Yeah, there it is. I didn't have this when I worked. You know, this I was handed and was published almost exactly timed with when I finished the TV documentary, the documentary episode. So you know, this was it has such journalistic integrity. It's so thorough. There's so much background that I referred to it, and at the same time, you know, I didn't want to just repeat, you know, work that other people had done. And I didn't let myself watch the KQED documentary, because I thought, well, then ideas are going to get in my head, or I'll compare, or I'll think I have to do that or interview that. So I didn't watch it. I didn't allow myself to. But the book was invaluable, you know, for the understanding of the neighborhood, the history, the culture, the vibe that was there, and informed my interview questions and informed my choices. Now and then I would write to one or both of Elizabeth and Lou and say, you know, I keep hearing this, is this right? Like, and Elizabeth would send very meticulous long answers. And so that was very helpful to the research. And they were the only people besides my bosses, my two bosses, who saw, you know, the cut when it was finished. Like, just please check, is this right? Is there anything wrong here? So that, you know, that was invaluable. Cutting it down, it was, you know, it's again, like I didn't take the material and reshape it. I tried to start with my own approach and that be, you know, one of my main research tools, you know, the things I heard people say, because I talked to a lot more people than made it to camera, you know, and unfortunately not, you know, it's like, it was a lot of editorial choices and editing down to cut it down like that. So it moves fast. So you pack the material in, you know, get the little snippets of quotes. So you keep moving through the timeline and decades of history, many issues. So yeah, it wasn't necessarily, it was, I guess, the whole history and all the topics and the people and the characters that could have been addressed was cut down. But I think I was just through the months making choices of like what to focus on and like, what is this, what is our purpose of, what is the story I'm telling, and where is it going to lead? You know, what is that conclusion where Mark Harris at the end says, you know, we're still here. So I can let Elizabeth talk more about the book.
So one of the things that intrigued me as I began researching the project, which was when I was 22, back in 1986, I'm now 56. So that shows you, this has pretty much been a project for most of my adult life. It's kind of incredible. Not only that it answered questions that I had had about these giant empty lots that were throughout the neighborhoods, even in the 80s when I started working as a day manager and historian at the Fillmore Auditorium. But as I began to research it, I realized that the story of the Fillmore neighborhood is a story of neighborhoods of color all over the United States, and bringing it to Massachusetts, it certainly happened, a massive redevelopment project in Boston, as I'm sure many of your viewers are very aware of. And so it was incredible for me to begin to understand how redevelopment came about, why it happened, and why these neighborhoods were often the target of it. And the role that the Fillmore played in actually changing the way that courts and who forced communities to recognize the people that lived in these neighborhoods and finally had rights to help determine how their neighborhoods would be redeveloped. And that was due to a court case that happened in the Fillmore. While it was kind of too late for the Fillmore, it had a big impact after that court case was settled in the favor of the neighborhood on other neighborhoods. So like I said, I was a day manager when Bill Graham went back into the Fillmore Auditorium. I was 22, and he asked that I would write a booklet about the Fillmore Auditorium, which was built in 1912. And in doing that research, I became really intrigued by what I discovered was the vibrant jazz, blues, and R&B entertainment district that was Harlem of the West, that preceded Graham's coming into the neighborhood in the late 1960s, when he first started booking shows at the Fillmore Auditorium. But I quickly found out that there was almost nothing in the archives that you would turn to, like the public library, the California Historical Society. And so I would literally walk up to people that I saw in the neighborhood. The Fillmore Auditorium is one of the few buildings that actually was not torn down in the redevelopment process. So it was still there, as was the apartment building owned by the same people across the street. And I would just ask them if they had gone to the clubs, if they knew where any photos might be, and slowly but surely started building this group of people and archival images and stories that in a few decades later turned into the book. Lewis, who's older than me, first came into the neighborhood in the mid 1960s, and he became intrigued with researching the neighborhood in almost around the same time that I did, in the late 1980s. But our paths didn't cross until I began working on the KQED documentary in 1997. And so when we met each other and realized that we've been both researching the neighborhood, that's when the idea for the book came about. So actually even though we both had been researching before, the KQED documentary came out first, then the book in its first iteration, and then a museum exhibit. And then we also have now a website which has the full interviews of all the people that we interviewed for the book.
What's the website? So I can put it in our chat.
It's Harlem of the West SF.com. So you spell it all out, Harlem of the West SF.com. It's a little long.
Oh, that's great. That would be very, for anyone who wants to do more research. Yeah, so there's a lot to your answer that I want to move along with. Something that I think is so fun about the show, combining, the perspectives of the book with sort of a new media perspective, is that moment where Lewis has the book and is flipping through it on the street. I love like a documentary moment where you have the book on screen. But yeah, so something that is also part of the description of the film, and I think how rich the film is with images, you almost forget how rare some of these archival images are. But I think what brings you back is when Lewis says, that he was looking for photos in the 90s and he couldn't find them, and they were in the back of the New Chicago barbershop, where, they could have been lost forever. Yeah, so I guess where I want to go with this, and Lubna, you talked about this a little bit in your first answer, was when you're reporting on something, or you're trying to create an archive of something, or you're trying to write a book about a historical period that's 70, 80 years ago, or in the 90s, 50 years ago, there's always, time marches on, and people are lost, and they take their stories with them. And it's amazing to see, people like Margie Baker interviewed, who would be a primary source. She was there. But there's also clearly we have a lot of interviews with, like, Sammy Peoples Jr. is talking about his father's experience and growing up around those people. But yeah, so I was wondering if you could talk a bit about when collecting this history for either the book or the video in particular, what were the difficulties that you had, any moments that arose regarding the complexities of time marching on when history hasn't been recorded?
Yeah, they were different processes, but they had the similarity that it was a long time ago, and that there was no central collection, and that it was spread longer and more grassroots, I think, for Elizabeth and Lewis, where they were getting the things from families. And I've heard them say often that when word got out about the book and the first edition was, more people had photos. And with my process, it was like, the first thing I got from Lewis Watts when we met, right when I was assigned this thing, and I didn't start doing anything until I felt like I understood it and researched, was, I asked him, the photos in the book, and he goes, they're all owned by the families and libraries. So, I didn't get handed anything. So they did this work to get and find and permissions the photos. And I did in my own way. I went to the Bancroft Library in Berkeley, and you sit in a room I've never done this as a journalist, you go to a room of the Bancroft Library, and you wear gloves, and you sit at a numbered desk, and they bring you the boxes that you requested. So I had to look and make sure, that it's is it Elizabeth, the David Johnson collections there, right? Oh, it was so many months ago.
Yeah.
One collection is, at the Bancroft Library, and they purchased that from his family and from him. And so, look it up, make sure this is the right year, and make sure this is actually in the Western edition. And then the San Francisco Public Library, the History Center, they have other photos of the streets, and, and then the families, the Steve Jackson Jr. And then I had to have Lewis help me get in touch with the families and ask, and this is what I'm using it for, and it's not for profit, and we want the photos to be seen. So it was, in a way, like I had the step of knowing what kind of photos were out there from the book and from their work, and then repeating the getting them and the permissions. So that's the photos, and they're, you could say they're rare. I mean, they're with people, they're with families, they're spread across different sources, and thank goodness you can see them on the website, and the Harlem of the West website, and in the book. And finding people was also a challenge. Get in touch with these people. They don't all have LinkedIn and Facebook pages, and who will talk and who will be on camera. And again, like Margie Baker, she was young, she was there, but she wasn't one of the people playing. Like John Handy is alive, and he wasn't kind of up for doing an interview. And yeah, so finding the people, a lot of them are, between kind of the making of the book and the KQED documentary aren't here any longer, and just choosing the people who could just give just that sentence, or just that description, or just that analysis was I think my task for the 2020 version. And then yeah, there's more to that. I'm sure Elizabeth can talk about the characters and the photos.
Yeah, it like I said, when we started, it was really challenging because there wasn't any person or place that we could really turn to. So we're kind of building it ourselves in a way. Like I said, each of us on our own, and then when we came together. But it's amazing how generous people were, especially since it was an extraordinarily painful time at one point. It was both, a lot of the people that we interviewed, it was both the most amazing time in their lives, and then when redevelopment happened, one of the most painful times in their lives. And I was just so grateful that people were willing to be vulnerable and talk about both experiences, and the yin and yang of the neighborhood as it went from this vibrant community to being decimated by the government. And so, and then once that they realized what we were trying to do, then handing us off to other people, like, oh, you have to call this person. Oh, this person was a photographer back then. And it's amazing what if you are open and willing to talk about your project, the things that come your way. I mean, the Steve Jackson photos with the iconic photo of John Coltrane, John Handy, Pony Poindexter, and Frank Fisher on the cover of the first 3 editions of the book. There's actually 4 editions of the book. That came about because of a conversation I had in a taxi with a cab driver. And he's like, oh, I think I used to play cards with this guy, and I think he was a photographer at one of those jazz clubs. I'll give you a call if I can find him. And it took him a month, but sure enough, he calls me back. And Mr. Jackson was willing to speak with me, even though he was quite sick. And I went to his house in Hunters Point, and he pulled back the curtain like a game show. And there was this floor to ceiling bookcase of negatives and photographs and other things. And I couldn't believe it. And that he was willing to share it with me. So things like that happened quite often. So I really recommend anyone that is a budding journalist to take chances like that. Talk to people, boots on the street, they always say, and it really does pay off.
Yeah, I had a similar experience just telling my friends, my native San Francisco friend, especially, who's an urban planner. And he knew this whole story. I mean, he knew all of it. And he says, oh, wait, I know somebody who I grew up with, and, oh, he went to your high school, and he, his mother, and, blah, 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 and connect. And then I went downtown to a medical building and got a few photos, a few black and white photos. So the 2 there's two photos of the woman with the two children standing on the street in the Western edition, and then the stoop, the musicians playing on the stoop. Those were like, like exactly what Elizabeth said, connect, and scored these photos. And I was very proud. I felt like this kind of like baby, like showing those photos to this established, to Lewis. I sent them, I think, to you guys over email, and look what I found. Have you seen these? Oh, I'd never seen these photos before. So I connected them so he could get the photos too. And each one is such a score. I mean, probably Elizabeth feels this, but each photo was such a score and such a precious thing. And when you make television, it's like the frame's changing every 3 to 5 seconds. So how many shots do you need? So I just had to keep like collecting, searching, looking, and until the deadline, until it was done, I was getting photos. And it's just like Elizabeth said, once I started talking to people myself, not just reading about the story, I saw what it meant to people. And I saw what an important part of the city's history, Black history in the city, what an important time it was. And that it's just not there. You go to the Fillmore and it's kind of, it's aside from what you saw in the second half of the piece, it's tragic.
Yeah. So I think with that, I'd like to sort of move on to the discussion of the bookended tragedies, and also because so the way that the Fillmore Heyday was able to begin was because of this mass racialized displacement of Japanese Americans through internment, which made physical space for the Black community to become the largest community in the neighborhood. And then mass displacement through urban development then was the end of this. And we can also later sort of talk about the role that segregation played, because there is some discussion about that in the show as well. But the question I have is sort of heavy, but as people making media about history, particularly about the histories of marginalized people, particularly Black people in the US, what is the significance of the fact that this big cultural boom that was relatively short historically, that it's bookended by these two tragedies of mass displacement, of the tension between the city and the people?
Yeah, what's the significance of it? I mean, I don't feel particularly qualified to say that it means, anything in particular in the broader sense. Like, was it, these are questions maybe Elizabeth can answer my own questions, but these came up for me also at making it, like, how much of a coincidence was this? How much, that just these factors were in place. Even the Western edition being there at all was because of the earthquake, right? It's like the downtown fell apart, and then this was the edition in the West afterward. And, became this thriving, neighborhood of immigrants. So, this horrible thing happens where this Japanese American neighborhood is kind of decimated. And then there's, I asked these questions, and then it became a little bit too detailed for me to get into in a short episode, and with a focused subject, to branch out into these things. But there's, what happened to the Japanese Americans' properties, like the deeds, the titles? Were they kept for them? Were then the African Americans like taking care of these properties? So that's a question that a few people have answered, that sometimes it was like this and sometimes it was like that. Elizabeth is stronger in the history of the neighborhood, these particular points. But I mean, it's like you want to say that this culture was always there and is always there and was given this space to thrive, even, bookended in between these sort of difficult tragedies and the taking away and the destructive energies, in the pause of those destructive energies, when, you had wall-to-wall people, like Lewis says in his interview, this culture that was there just boomed and thrived. And that was my impression, that it was always there, and then this space became created for it to really become visible and become, people had money in their pockets, people dressed up, people, it was mixed. Like, there was a lot of people going out there to those clubs and staying out all night. It was welcoming, like I narrated. So I think the significance of it, I'm thinking as I'm talking to your question, what is the significance that this wonderful positive thing was bookended by tragedy, is that, what a shame that the destructiveness happened at all. And, if only these spaces and these neighborhoods and these, kind of, space, the field that this can happen in were there, because the culture is there, and those desires and the joy, like Mark Harris says about the Black, or it was either Mark Harris or the twins at the African American Cultural Center. They both talk about Black joy, that it's there. Yeah, so it just was able to really emerge without the inhibitions of redevelopment or, today, the sort of gentrification and the cost of living that are happening. So do you want to say more about that, Elizabeth? I'm sure you'll have a totally different approach.
No, I just want to add to that, is that I think that it speaks to the importance of allowing neighborhoods to grow and change organically without the influence of government, because the Fillmore became Harlem of the West because of the people in the community who made it that. It wasn't that the government set out to do this. It was in spite of the government, in fact, because there was racial covenants in the deeds of most houses in San Francisco, which did not allow people of color to live in most of the neighborhoods in San Francisco. In fact, those racial covenants are still in many deeds and houses today. If you buy a house in San Francisco, you'll see it, even though certainly they're not enforced. So to me, what happened in the Fillmore again shows the importance of history and people understanding history and understanding what happened to the Fillmore and the tragedy of the government interfering with that neighborhood to its demise, and learning from it and not allowing it to happen again. But I would argue that in San Francisco, unfortunately, lessons haven't been learned. And while we don't do these sweeping 20-block redevelopment projects any longer in very many places around the United States, in some ways it's more terrible in the way that changes happen, because it's building by building, block by block, until suddenly you look around and all the historic buildings are gone. All the people that made each neighborhood interesting and different from the one next to it have been displaced for money and power and all these things that go into gentrification. And so that, to me, is the biggest tragedy of all of this story, is that we haven't learned from it, and it keeps happening. And at what cost?
Yeah, I definitely want to keep that thread of, this is the lessons have not been learned a little bit later, but I do, yeah, so that, great answers. Thank you both for those answers. Those are wonderful. But to move along, I think, to stay on this sort of topic, there is a part in the show where Margie Baker is explaining that traveling Black musicians on the circuit that would visit the Fillmore weren't able to stay in hotels in the Fillmore, which sort of, it's like the conditions of racial segregation, and then the creation of the the adaptation of the community. So then they had clubs that were open all night, so that people would have something to do instead of not being able to stay in a hotel. So I was wondering, Elizabeth, and maybe Lubna as well, if you could talk a little bit about the role that segregation played during the heyday of the Filmware.
This was actually one of the questions I had to email Elizabeth, so I'll let her pick it up because she answered me. But I heard this in different variations. So Van Ness Avenue is kind of a big downtown street, and it was and I think I'm getting this right. What Margie was saying was the clubs east of Van Ness were where the bigger, Black traveling musicians could play but not sleep. So they did come and sleep in the Fillmore because it was a Black neighborhood. And because they were coming back home after hour, not home, but, to spend the night in the Fillmore, that's why there was the after hours all night performances, because they were welcome and it wasn't segregated. So over in the bigger venues, east of Van Ness, they could play, they couldn't stay there. So yeah, and then I heard it in different versions, and that was one of the things I had to email Elizabeth and Lewis, like, Margie Baker said this and other people are saying it differently, and she clarified for me, so maybe she can go in more detail now.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification.
That's absolutely right. The bigger clubs downtown San Francisco were only open to the most famous African-American musicians, but even they were like Ella Fitzgerald, Dinah Washington, were not allowed to stay in those hotels like the Fairmont, those iconic San Francisco downtown hotels. And they had to come back to the Fillmore in order to stay. And, after you play, you're still kind of jacked up. So you go to these after hours clubs and play for your own community. And that's why at its peak, there were more than 20 clubs, both, ones, regular ones, licensed ones, and then ones, once the bars would close, that would open up. And then also people had little speakeasies in the basements of their houses. So there's also house parties going on as well, where local musicians would play, and somebody might be standing in the corner selling beer out of a fridge. So it was a really vibrant neighborhood to come back to. But yeah, I think, San Francisco has this reputation for being this very accepting, groovy place. And certainly compared to other parts of the United States during the 40s and 50s, it certainly was. But there still was this segregation going on. In fact, the Musicians Union was segregated until 1959. And so that also caused African-American musicians and other musicians of color to not be able to play anywhere but in the Fillmore district.
And so there's that line, and I had to find the right word, and it was ironically, it was the segregation of the city, that the downtown that fed into the thriving scene, because then there's segregation happening in the downtown hotels, and the famous Black musicians weren't staying the night there, and they were coming back. So one of the things that the editor I worked with, who edited this the piece with me, he was most fascinated with, like, that's just like amazing that you could rub shoulders as a neighborhood local or as somebody going out for them. You could rub shoulders with these like really big musicians at these jam sessions. And that was because, ironically, that was because of the downtown segregation partly. And, like in Elizabeth's words, they went back to their own community, and that was a welcoming place. You see in the photos, there's the Black communities there, and there's white people there, and it's mixed. It was welcoming from what I understand.
So we have a question from the chat that is sort of moving us into this conversation about the present. So I think, let's start with this. So Nelson James Hutchison says, thank you so much for this talk. Could Elizabeth or Lubna speak to the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency's efforts to create the historic Fillmore Jazz Preservation District and/or the Fillmore Heritage Center? I feel like there is a tension in the fact that the same agency that dismantled the Harlem of the West used its history to brand the neighborhood. So I think we're sort of getting into a theme later in sort of the second half of the show that I think we're gonna that there's a lot to talk about. Is this continued new sort of tension between the city and the people and the arts culture of that has not only been sort of like Mark Harris says, the visual artists in the neighborhood who are left over from the Harlem of the West, or who are trying to revive or create a new Harlem of the West, or to just, revive or renew in that way are survivors. And, what are they survivors of? They're survivors of their material conditions and the city and what the city decides to do. So, yeah. So, how do you feel about that question? Any initial responses?
I'll skim it because like Elizabeth knows more of the details of the history. And, and it's, you asked about, making, the video versus the book. Like my goal was to tell the story and to cover the topics, but it was really limited how detailed and how in depth, whereas the book is like everything, everything's in there in the book. So, there have been these efforts to revive, to create, the Fillmore Jazz District every summer, not this last summer, but there's a pretty big, Fillmore Jazz Festival. So you have that, it draws, thousands or tens of thousands of people. But is there a lot of jazz happening now there? Not really. There's that very big building that we have a couple of shots of, the Fillmore Heritage Center that's closed. That's been, it's not for me to go into the details, but if anybody researched it, you'll see several news articles about the strife that's happened over that building, sadly. And I had to make that choice to just, I'm going to say that this building is here, but I'm not going to go into, lawsuits and counter lawsuits in the city and, who's going to run it and what's going to happen there. So, the city stuff, maybe Elizabeth can say more about, but Darlene Roberts and Dr. David Hardiman, have started this initiative, Fillmore Jazz Ambassadors, and they have this dream and they're working on funding and workshops that they would like to have in that building, that they would like to teach children and have workshops and teach the history and teach jazz and have performances. So there are very good intentions about, about the neighborhood, and knowing that, that there is this, and then that's a question I wrote in the script for Kelly Daly, who lives in the neighborhood. She's actually, I've known her for, since we were both in grad school for journalism, and she's in the neighborhood. She's a local Black female artist and journalist. And so I wrote that line of, are the efforts to revive the neighborhood's jazz history, like, is it just like a wish or like a nod to the past, or is there anything happening now? And the things that are happening there now are happening from artists themselves, from the Mark Harris and the Jacory Baptiste and the Black residents who are still there. That's my sense, not the city. I think the city has grants and things you can apply for and good intentions, but I can't, going over there. And I actually lived on Fillmore Street and then the next neighborhood south, of the Western Addition for 2.5 years on Fillmore. And, I go over there, there's a couple places you can see live jazz, 2 places still, but is it coming back? Like one of the characters says, like, Sammy Peoples Jr., like, is our neighborhood coming back? Like, I don't see that happening. So yeah, Elizabeth can say more about the city, maybe.
Well, the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency doesn't even exist anymore, and it hasn't for a number of years. I think it was throughout the United States, redevelopment agencies have all been closed down. I know definitely in California, all the redevelopment agencies have been shut down for 4 or 5 years. So the Jazz Heritage Center was the last property that was built through the redevelopment agency, and then it was dissolved after that. But they had the best of intentions in trying to bring things back, but you can't bring something back that was created organically by the neighborhood. And not only that, jazz in the 40s and 50s and blues and R&B, that was the prominent music of that time. That's not the case any longer. And you don't have the number of people in the neighborhood who, for that music, it draws them into the neighborhoods. So it's just impossible to bring, 20 jazz clubs back. There's just not the amount of people that are interested in the music any longer. But I definitely agree that that doesn't mean that the Fillmore is a stagnant and dead, or even dead, there are many young musicians and artists and writers and creative people in that neighborhood of all colors that are doing things on their own, certainly without any help from the government. And they're the ones that are making it happen. But this fantasy Disneyland-like Harlem of the West thing, it's a fantasy. It's just, it wouldn't be cool anyway, because the government's involved. Nothing with the government touches is ever cool. I mean, let's just say, sorry, government, but seriously.
Yeah. Let me see here. Oh, something I wanted to ask. We can get back to this conversation about the government and whether or not something involving the government is cool or not. But well, before we forget all about the actual physicality of the tearing down of people's homes and the displacement, there's a really interesting story in here about Jimbo's Bop City being physically picked up and moved to another part of the neighborhood and then becoming a Black-owned bookstore. And then getting landmark status, and all of that having to do with a neighborhood effort by activists. So I wanted to hear if there are any more stories like that, first of all, that were in the book but not able to make it to the show. And also just, yeah, I'd love to talk about how we also have sort of those moments of the new photos over, like cross-fading over the old photos, and how the built environment of a neighborhood changes. Yeah, so let's talk about what has physically survived, what has been moved, and that physical process of urban development.
When I found out about that, I think it was verbally actually from Lewis Watts, if not from the book, that, because I was like, planning the interview, like, hey, where should we meet? Where should we set up the camera? And I was like, let's do it in front, I'd done my research, so I knew the address of the Victorian that was Bop City. And so let's meet in front of the Victorian. At some point before or during the interview, he said, oh, it was around the corner. And I was exactly like I reacted on camera, or like in the narrative, like, what? Really? It's like, oh yeah, that's finally when the neighborhood was just like, no, like, and they were able to stop some of the, because from what I understand, I think it was Sammy Peoples Jr. who told me, like, or some, other people told me, like, yeah, they looked at the Victorians as these old, antiquated, rat-infested, rat traps. And it was just like, get them out of here. Let's make some modern buildings. And you know how we feel about our Victorians now in San Francisco. So what I learned, I know about that story, and I learned about sort of like there are buildings that you see there now that were a thing, or that were a significant, venue that Elizabeth can talk more about. But one really nice touch was that when we finished, it was in February, so for African American History Month. It's also when this edition of the book came out. When I tried to get the book before this edition came out, they emailed me like, you got to get it from the library. You can't buy it anywhere. So I had to go to the library and get the previous edition to do the research. But the book and the documentary got finished in February for African American History Month. We held a community screening and a party at the Boom Boom Room, which is a live music venue, which is like they're dwindling now in San Francisco. And like, remind me, Elizabeth, what was that was a venue. That's one of the last actually things that was, you could look at the wonderful map in the book, but what was it? And then maybe you can tell.
It was the second location of Jack's of Sutter.
That's right, yeah.
When the redevelopment agency forced Jack's to move off of Sutter Street, it relocated to the building on Geary and Fillmore, and then in the mid 80s was turned into the Boom Boom Room.
And then more stories. I can't think of any. It's been a few months, but you'll know.
Well, the reason why Bop City and actually probably a few dozen other Victorians were moved was, as you mentioned, a result of the lawsuit brought forth by Waco, which was the community organization in the mid 60s that tried to stop redevelopment. So redevelopment in the Fillmore was in two parts, A1 and A2. So A1, which started in 1953, the very first building came down. No one really knew what this was going to look like, because redevelopment, although a concept that started in the 1920s didn't really happen anywhere in the United States until after World War II, for obvious reasons. You had the Depression, and then you had the war, and then, you know, everyone comes back and it's, you know, the atomic age and big fins and everything's new and modern and plastic. So Victorians, as Livna said, were just not cool back then. So when the neighborhood started seeing all these buildings come down and realized that they were not going to get financially compensated, whether they owned the building or were renters, and they were just told to get out and no help from the government at all, where to relocate. It's just like, get out of here, you're in our way. That's when the neighborhood started to band together to try and stop A2. So they weren't able to stop it, as I mentioned before, but they did get some concessions. And one of them was that the Victorians that hadn't been torn down yet, whenever possible, were jacked up onto trucks. And you can't even believe that I've seen these pictures of photographer that started shooting this after kind of the part of the Fillmore history that we cover in the book. And they would cart them to these different places around the neighborhood. And sometimes they'd fall off the truck. You see this 2-story Victorian like sideways on the street. So that's how Bop City, which was on Post Street, Post and Buchanan, was moved around the corner onto Fillmore Street. And you can kind of tell because they're set back. Victorians in San Francisco tend to be pretty forward on the lot line, right on the sidewalk there. And the 3 Victorians, they call it Victorian Square, even though it's not a square, they're set back a bit. So they look different from the rest of that block. I gotta turn on the light, it's starting to get dark in here.
I walked by, that was 5-6 blocks from where I was living on Fillmore further south. And I walked by that block so many times. I had no idea. It's worth mentioning that, Marcus Books, which closed, continues to live. So they have a branch in Oakland, and I follow their social media, and they just put out a wonderful post saying, we're shipping now we're online, we're on, I think, whatever the website, Bookshop, I think. They're on a website now, and they're shipping nationally. So, yay for Marcus Books. Not in that location, but they live on.
Yeah. So I'd like to talk a bit about the new artists, the present artists featured in the show. One sort of striking thing that I think sort of ties into our last discussion a bit was Mark Harris's, here, let's start with this. Why did you choose to interview the new artists that you chose to interview?
I spent a lot of time not doing anything and just talking to people and asking questions and reading and thinking. And I think that's why a lot of the decisions ended up being made, because I didn't just get the camera and write the script and boom, boom, boom. I took a lot of time. I talked to a lot of people who then, were not interviewed, but heavily influenced. And I think I made a choice early on that I didn't personally want to produce just here's the history, the end historical documentary. I really wanted to, bring current context and ask questions what's happening now. And, because a lot of the articles and a lot of what the narrative that's in people's consciousness, if they do know anything, is hey, it was a great heyday, and it was all this, bustling and blah, 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 and then redevelopment, and then the end, right? So you reach the 70s there. And, because of who we are, because of the kind of journalism I do, and because of where, the public access TV station, and to give it sort of that added layer, I wanted to ask those questions about what's happening now and what is the city doing. When we say the narrative of the heyday was great and then they tore it down, the end, what does the city say about that, right? Why did that happen? What are you doing about that now? What about artists of color? And I wanted to have contemporary you know, existing artists of color who are linked to the neighborhood, you know, say what they're doing and what their hopes are and what their issues are. And that's where, you know, Mark Harris and Jacory Baptiste were chosen to cover two different, you know, they give very different interviews, right? They talk about different things. And also, you know, in that period of time where I was just telling everybody, you know, people who were topical experts and then people in my personal life who are San Francisco people or jazz people, hey, I'm doing this thing. What do you think? What approach? And what should I cover? And how should, you know, I talked to people at the African American Historical Society. They have a longer name than that. And I people who had a relationship to the subject, I always ended my sort of questioning of them before I was actually doing anything on camera or writing scripts saying, now that you know that somebody is making, you know, a TV episode or documentary on this subject, what do you expect to see in it when it's done? What questions do you have? And so many times I heard, who are the artists there now? What's happening there now? And that, like, did I already have that idea? Was that already my intention? I can't remember. I just know that so many people said, who's there now? That I said, I have to include this. And, you know, the interview with Jacory Baptiste was like last, like most of the thing was edited and you know, done. That first half, the first segment was pretty much edited. And then we did this last, and my bosses were like, what, another shoot? Aren't you done yet? You know, it just filled a nice little hole because he's so positive and he is so, you know, such a Fillmore person, such a jazz person, such a sort of so informed by the history and the legacy and the story. So yeah.
Yeah, Jacory Baptiste, that's so interesting because I feel like Jacory Baptiste's interview really is the thread between the old and the new, because it sort of, well, it offers the thread of mentorship as a way to go from the old and the new. Yeah, so Elizabeth, do you have anything to say about that question, or do you?
Well, I think it's emblematic of the Fillmore itself and the history of the music, because that's the way the musicians during the heyday in the 40s and 50s who grew up in that neighborhood talk about the older guys mentoring them. And so it's this lovely thread that continues to this day. So I really loved that you added that in there. That was a wonderful addition to the story.
Sort of the less lovely thread that ties the stories together is Mark Harris, who is the visual artist featured, who has these incredible visual pieces, collages, I would think would be the technical word, about the Fillmore's history, is part of the collective called the 3.9 Collective, which is named such because they're some kind of census, theoretical census, that in the next year or so, I believe he says, the population of African Americans in the city will be 3.9%, whereas in 1970 it was 13, I think he says. So that sort of brings us to the question, you know, are the problems faced? Yeah, as Elizabeth said previously, you know, are these problems that have been learned from by any sense? And is there something is there a tension in memorializing this history while also similar gentrification and the, you know, people who create this kind of art being pushed out of neighborhoods? Yeah, is there a tension there? I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts more on that.
Yeah. So yeah, I think you got it right that by the upcoming census results, it's estimated to be 3.9%. That's really low. I mean, like I said, I'm a San Francisco native, and when I grew up here, you know, 80s, 90s, like it was diverse here, right? There was like before the first tech bubble of the late 90s, like it was diverse. And I don't feel that right now in San Francisco. You know, I live across the bay now, but in San Francisco, there is a growing like homogenous, income level, sort of like less racial diversity, less age diversity, even like, seeing little kids or seeing grandmothers is less now. Some of the factors that come are cost of living, that's one thing. The city's failed attempts or lack of attempts to nurture and give, kind of that space and that attention, to use your word, to artists and artists of color and communities of color. We have the two, as a journalist should do. I'm not going to let people get on screen and accuse the city of things without bringing the city on camera. A couple of officials to, what are you doing? And so, it's like they say, we have grants, Cheryl Davis, she's from the neighborhood. She cares about this, but good intentions again, but then you have Mark Harris saying, put your money where your mouth is, so there's things like the things that have been desired or spoken about, such as live workspaces, subsidized housing or things for artists that I can't really give you one example of like, there's this great initiative and it's really helping. The mayor just passed a initiative to give $1,000 monthly stipend to new Black mothers. So, there's like these kinds of things. Why? Because their mortality rate for the mothers twice as high as any other racial group. So there's kind of like, it's on people's radar, support for communities of color and Black communities, but there's limited, I think, actual initiatives that you can cite. We do have a San Francisco Arts Commission, so that's good that there's an Arts Commission. There are grants you can apply for. They're supportive. Barbara Mumbi Huerta is no longer with the Arts Commission, but they try, they care as well. Does Elizabeth have something to add, maybe? We have different knowledge bases on this, so I'm sure there's more.
No, I think you pretty much covered it. I don't see the city having put their money where their mouth is for a long time now, ever since the 90s. I think when the powers that be decided that tech was going to be the savior of San Francisco, and bring in all these jobs and all this money and all this stuff that we were fed back in the late 80s and early 90s after the earthquake of 89, the decision was made and the deals were made, and everyone else was fodder. And sadly, many people got pushed out yet again. And the things that make San Francisco so unique and for decades were celebrated, the artists, the musicians, the writers, the eccentric people, this wonderful stew of people from, it was like this beacon where all the weirdos from all over the United States could come to San Francisco and find their tribe, and not only find like-minded people, but also, have room to find themselves, because the city wasn't that expensive back then. And so you could like go to San Francisco State and work at a coffee shop and play in a punk rock band, or, be a painter. That hasn't happened since the early 90s. And the city has decided that that's not important. But it's a tragedy, because certainly, in the time that I've been on this planet, I've seen the San Francisco that I knew and loved, and really that helped me become the person who I am, a creative person, and figuring out how I could actually make a living as a creative person, that's not available to very many young people in San Francisco or even in the Bay Area any longer. And San Francisco is suffering because of it. As you pointed out, there's not very many clubs to go see music anymore. I mean, but where can you even go rehearse if you're in a band? Because everything's so expensive. There's not even spaces for bands to rehearse, to be able to play in clubs. So you have this domino effect. And it's such a shame. It really, really is a shame.
Yeah, same experience for me, you know, like the city's quirky, eccentric, open, creative, diverse foundations shaped my own, you know, creative sort of side, I guess you could say. And the irony of it is like, yeah, you know, tech is our thing. And then, you know, you move here for your huge 6-figure, $200,000, whatever, you know, your huge tech job. And then you come and it's like, where's all the fun? Where's all the San Francisco art? And so, you know, the people who are coming here and who are drawn here and who can afford to live here now, really aren't getting the things that have been so iconic and definitive of San Francisco. And I think it's been that way for a while. I don't think anybody's surprised, you know, that you come to San Francisco and it's not live music and hippies anymore. You know, I think it's Michelin starred restaurants and, you know, condo buildings. And there's this headline a few weeks ago that like, which club was it? Slim's or one of the live music venues closed and has changed ownership. And the headline was that they will only be having DJs in top 40, you know, parties. And it was just like the comments on the local social media, the local articles and the social media were like, wow, like this super iconic live music venue that had been such a part of people's, you know, upbringings or youth here, you know, is now just going to be top 40 DJ club.
Yeah, started by Boz Scaggs.
Yeah. Was it Slim's?
Yeah.
I mean, I think to draw it all together, you know, this is the situation in many, many American cities. I would say most major cities. You know, earlier in the conversation, we were sort of talking about, you know, the tearing down of physically important buildings. And it just reminded me that in the past, I believe last month, there was a giant demonstration in Boston. There's a Roxbury Love mural that was incredibly important to the community in Roxbury that was being torn down to build, you know, an apartment complex, a high rise. So this is the way that cities are developing. And it is a tragedy.
Yeah, and the question remains, you know, we did the research and we did the interviews and we asked the city and we talk amongst ourselves, and the question remains, like, what can and what should be done? What are the steps? What do you do to support and encourage the arts and a thriving, you know, is it like funding the arts in schools? Is it like subsidizing recording spaces and housing and art, you know, so that question remains, you know, what is the way to do it? And how do you attract and keep artists? They're so, you know, I think Barbara Mumbuy-Huerte says, like, you can't have a community in a city without the arts. So
I liked what Elizabeth said before, that it's not so much the arts, it's the people. You know, the people will make the art. It's, you know, it's making sure that people can be there.
Well, it's giving space to people to do what people are going to do if allowed to do it. And it's that organic creation of neighborhoods that I think needs to be fostered and not controlled by the government, because the tech industry didn't happen organically. That was done in backroom deals with a lot of tax credits and a lot of effort.
And a different kind of subsidy.
Yeah, exactly. So, and we also have the location of being around a lot of high profile universities where super smart people are, you know, thinking about these things. But, you know, when San Francisco lost a lot of its big businesses in the 80s, which is when I came up, I graduated from high school in 82. And, you know, for me, it was this giant playground because all these big businesses like Levi's and Bank of America and Wells Fargo that employed tons and tons of people, they left San Francisco in the 80s. And actually the population went down to the lowest it had been in a long time. And so there was all these empty warehouses throughout the 80s. And all of us who were in the arts took advantage of that big time. And then, you know, San Francisco decided tech was going to be its savior and, you know, put all its eggs in one basket instead of trying to keep, you know, I don't hate the tech industry. I use tech all the time. We're using tech right now to talk to each other in various parts of the United States. But I think creating this monoculture in the Bay Area at the detriment of the people, other people that don't want to participate in that has been really a terrible thing on so many different levels.
And the tech people, but you know, a lot of them are new transplants, and they may also not want to participate in the culture in the neighborhoods. You know, you're saying like not all the community neighborhoods want to participate in the tech thing, but also not all the transplants come in with this like a cultureization, you know, being, you know, sort of like honor your neighborhood and the diversity that's there, and you know what was there before you and the culture that was here before you, and integrate into that, come into that. So, you know, I would sort of put this out there. I don't know, nobody knows the answer of like how do you support the arts, but neighborhoods is a very important key, as you see with the Fillmore. And then, you know, there's the neighborhood thing and communities around a neighborhood, and you know, this has been what Transmission, the show that we, you know, to come full circle about how we started our discussion tonight. You know, Transmission was, and you know, this was the first episode that I took over of Transmission, and it was, you know, had a little bit of extra funding, so it was a big one. But you know, the host Kelly says at the end, our next episode is going to be about arts and culture in the Tenderloin. So I had started researching, you know, a neighborhood that's known for being somewhat blighted now. You know, a lot of unhoused population, a lot of open drug use. You know, it's pretty bad out there right now, and yet, you know, there is art, and there are arts institutions, and there's culture there. So I started researching before everything shut down, and we're just starting to have ideas about doing field production again. So that's exciting. You know, I'm sort of itching to move away from emails and editing and do more field production. And the neighborhood thing, I think, is really the answer. I love that. I brought that up. Thank you.
Great. So obviously this is a discussion that could go on for hours and hours more, but I'm thinking that we should wrap it up a little bit. Al, do you have any questions?
No, I mean, you know, I was just sort of listening and reflecting about sort of the last words you were talking about, Lubna, about neighborhoods and about your work at BAVAC, and just, I don't know in your year there if you've seen anything about that could sort of allow you to reflect on how neighborhoods are changing. Like BAVAC does a lot of work as we do with very local groups and with voices that don't generally maybe have access. And so, you know, I wonder if those neighborhoods are as easily possible today as they once were in reflection, and how things are changing along those lines when you see gentrification happening, and when we face a lot of very similar issues actually out here on a very microscopic level. In Northampton, this is a very big arts community that is struggling to sort of support and be affordable for artists, and it's a different dynamic. But you just wonder how tech might be. I wonder how tech might be changing the sort of shape of those things.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, certainly at BAVAC, we have a couple of youth programs, we have a preservation department, we have media maker fellowships, and we support documentarians and storytellers who are doing their work. So we have a specifically anti-racist, underserved, underrepresented voices approach, and that's BAVAC as a whole. And then what I have learned, so I've been kind of with BAVAC for 2 years, but in this role for 1 year, managing the public access TV station. And our station's members and producers, so the people who make public access television and participate in the community, that is an over 70% Black population. So that is not, that's very different than the city's makeup. I have the statistics somewhere, it's like 86% or 76, like a pretty high percentage that I should know offhand, and a lot of other POC or Asian American. And so I've come to know from two things. One, from working with these producers and the two staff on my team, the SF Commons team, work with them more one-on-one and with the programming. And we know what is of issue to them, and how we try to support them. We're here, whatever you want to say, you're telling we're not journalists talking about you and your communities. You tell your stories, you tell your communities, as you do, I'm sure, at Northampton Open Media. So I've learned, I've gotten to know sort of a little bit more about those communities and voices you don't hear that much about in the city. One, through SF Commons, through our public access TV station. And then I started, while sheltering during the pandemic, I was like, well, I'm at home, I can't go out and shoot this more neighborhood stuff. What am I going to do? And I started a show called SF Nonprofit Spotlight. So we started interviewing like this over Zoom. We started doing interviews and editing together photos of their work to nonprofits per episode. And so we've interviewed 20 nonprofits now. And then that is another thing where you learn what nonprofits who are serving communities, or nonprofit independent theater, or unhoused people, or underserved youth, giving them career skills. So I learned a lot about that. And then your question about what is there with neighborhoods, it's diluted. The Mission District with its vibrant Latino culture and Mexican American culture that I knew when I was it's there, but it's diluted because it's very hip and cool to live there. The Haight Ashbury, it's it's still there. It still looks like kind of almost what it used to look like, but it's it's also a desirable, expensive neighborhood to live in, and it has they have traces of the character that they had. But, more and more it is less families and less diverse income levels, less racially diverse. So, how do we bring that back, right? What are the things that have changed during our 6 months of, slowing down, having more intimate personal relationships with each other that maybe we could start in our homes and expand to our neighbors and neighborhoods? And wouldn't that be an amazing thing if we started some initiatives around more neighborhood culture, cultivating neighborhood culture? Something to think about, hope for, dream of.
Great. All right. There aren't any other questions. I guess sort of a final question would be, you sort of answered that a little bit, but what should we be looking out for that you're working on next? What should we watch that you worked on previously? I know that Transmission is a previous project, and this was obviously the bigger one, and you're working on a new episode now, but what else have you directed in the past that we should go watch? Everyone should go read Harlem of the West. Is there anything else we should read? Yeah, so give us your plugs.
Thank you for asking. I think currently the more Transmission episodes are cooking. So SF Commons has a YouTube page that we intend to nurture more, but our stuff is living on there. And you can see the things produced by our youth programs and the things that SF Commons producers make, the public access producers. My current project, SF Nonprofit Spotlight, it's pretty niche and local, but I've handed that off to one of our junior staff, who I'm super proud of. She took it over and she's producing it, so that's very local. And we're going to be starting a journalism department that we train people in. So that's kind of what I'm working on. itching for the next big creative thing, the next big story to make, you know, hopefully transmission and arts and culture and Tenderloin, but super kind of like more happening now and exciting is, you know, the new edition of the Harlem of the West book it's still new. It just came out, and as you saw, he's not with us in this moment, but as you saw, Louis Watts is an extraordinarily charismatic storyteller, and he and Elizabeth have an event coming up, so she can say more about the book and the event and where you can learn more about this story.
So yeah, thank you for mentioning that. Louis apologizes for not being able to be here. He had to help a friend with another Zoom talk today the same time, but if anyone wants to hear from both of us, it's San Francisco History Weekend starting on Friday, and we have a talk with the San Francisco Public Library at noon California time, so it'd be 3 o'clock on East Coast time. You can sign up for the event through San Francisco Public Library, either on their Facebook page or just go to their website. And the like I said, Harlem of the West book is available through Heyday Books. And it's 100 pages of new material. We keep unearthing things. It's unreal how things just keep coming to us. So that's wonderful. And then I'm working on a book about my own San Francisco history. So the music and art scene, alternative music and art scene in San Francisco in the late 70s up until the 1989 earthquake, and my friends' experiences during that time. The last hurrah of San Francisco weirdos.
Right. Well, thank you both so much for sharing not only this show, this vibrant history with us, these rare photos and these incredible interviews. And thank you so much for curating this history and doing the archival work and doing the boots on the ground work and sharing it with all of us and doing this interview.
Thank you so much. This is such a wonderful event that you host, and I'm inspired that you do these and this discussion. And it's, you know, it's like I said, it's been a few months, so it's really nice to dive back in and explore and like get to do this in tandem with Elizabeth as well and her history. I'm really lucky that I have their work to draw upon, and it's an extraordinary book, like the photos and the stories you get in the book. And I brought up the talk that they're doing because I've seen it. There's a visual presentation. It is super cool. So I really recommend people check that out. And thank you both so much. It's nice to have that sort of bi-coastal connection of our center like this.
Thank you to all three of you. I'm so grateful that you included me in this, and you all are doing amazing work. It's really keeping journalism alive. So I'm grateful for all three of you for doing that.
Well, I am going to say goodnight to our audience. Thank you everyone for watching. Focus Locus presents The Legacy of the Fillmore. And keep an eye out on our Northampton Open Media Facebook page, become a member, and stay tuned for more Focus Locuses, Wednesdays at 7 p.m. Although our next official one is October 14th, we'll have Tepper's Tots. So, all right, good night.